Good morning, folks. We're going to begin shortly. I invite you to get your coffee and take your seats. Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. Before we begin, there's a very important announcement. Someone dropped a hat or something on the way in. So if this is you, raise your hand. I'll bring it to you. There we go. All right. Well, once again, good morning. If you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, my name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here at St. Bart's, and it is a joy to welcome you to the Forum. Each week here at the Forum, we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And to fully introduce our esteemed guest, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, our seminarian from Yale Divinity School, Nathan Peace, who will explain a little bit about our guest and what brings her here today.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, we are so excited to welcome Professor Melanie Ross from Yale Divinity School and the Institute of Sacred Music. She is a scholar on evangelical worship. And I'm part of a series right now for people who have, quote-unquote, deconstructed from evangelicalism and have wandered into the Episcopal Church. And so as part of that, she's going to speak with us this afternoon, and fortunately with us this morning as well. So she holds a Master of Arts in Religion from Yale Divinity School and a PhD in Liturgical Studies from the University of Notre Dame. And I have it on good authority that she's also very willing to talk about Notre Dame football. So if there's something you'd like to talk about there, I think now is your chance as well. So Professor Ross, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you.
Well, Nathan, Peter, thank you so much for this invitation, and it is a real privilege to be with you all this morning, so thank you for having me. As Nathan mentioned, I am a scholar of evangelical worship. I grew up in a non-denominational evangelical church and was a musician there for much of my teenage and early adult life, and I've just been fascinated by the way that music has developed in my tradition and truthfully, some of the ways that it's changed very quickly from when I was in school in the 80s and 90s to what church music sounds like today. So my hope this morning is to do a very fast overview of some of those changes, and then maybe we can have some conversation about them afterwards. I want to open with two caveats. Well, both of them related to the fact that I can't say everything in this talk. And two things in particular I am leaving out. One is that there's a whole fascinating history of hymnody and how hymns have evolved from, say, 1950s to present day. I have to bracket all of that. Secondly, there's another parallel, really interesting trajectory about how gospel music has developed in the African American tradition, and I have to bracket that also. But if we're talking about kind of white evangelical praise and worship music or contemporary worship music, I want to start the story in, let's say, the 1960s, which was a very pivotal time for evangelicalism. In the book, The Juvenilization of American Christianity, the historian Thomas Bergler, isn't that a great title? Thomas Bergler explains how evangelical youth ministries tried to beat American youth culture at its own game. And it changed the way that evangelical congregations worshiped. So we're thinking about the time in the 1940s and the 1950s when secularism is running rampant. We are in a post-World War II era. You've got the Bobby Sockers who are off listening to the jukebox and the secular music and to Frank Sinatra. Teenage crime rates are jumping. Grown-ups are fretting about the youth problem and what to do with our young people. And so as a way to kind of inoculate young people from temptation, evangelicals decided to make their own teenage counterculture. And a key player in this was Youth for Christ Ministries, which was an evangelical organization that engineered rallies in churches all across the country. Perhaps some of you recognize this young charismatic speaker at Youth for Christ. It is Billy Graham, yes. That was one of the ways that he got his start, was speaking to these youth organizations. And in the early days, Youth for Christ could really compete with the best entertainment options that the world had to offer. They had motivational speakers and athletes and heroes who were back from war giving their testimonies. They had film stars, they had amazing choirs. They also, this is just a side note, but it's a little piece of history that always makes me laugh. In some places, they had an attraction called the Gospel Horse. And the Gospel Horse would come out on stage, and you would ask him how many members are there in the Trinity, and he would paw the stage 3 times, or they'd ask the Gospel Horse to imitate what the girls looked like in the choir when they were chewing gum, and he would do that. But there was one rally that stood out, at least to Billy Graham, in 1946. He was holding a religious rally at the Galesburg Armory, and there was a gospel horse named Ranger who was sharing the program with Billy. And Ranger came out on stage before Billy Graham preached, and they asked the horse, how many disciples did Jesus have? And he banged the floor 12 times. When they asked Ranger what time it was, he stomped 8 times for 8 o'clock. And as one reporter of the day put it, not only was the standing room only crowd excited, so was Ranger. He proceeded to urinate all over the stage area, and moments later, Billy Graham was forced to stand in it while he preached. After the meeting, on the drive back to Chicago, Graham was quoted as telling his assistant, "That's the last time I will be booked with a gospel horse." Watch, a gospel horse will be the only thing you remember from this talk. I'm sorry. But I mention all of that to say that YFC was the height of entertainment. It was doing really groundbreaking things at the time. And probably the most famous musician of the YFC movement was Ralph Carmichael, who had written tunes for Hollywood. He had arranged for Ella Fitzgerald. And Ralph Carmichael teamed up with YFC and helped transform American teenage tastes in sacred music. So he wrote gospel songs that combined the emotionalism of the revival era with the popularity of American rock and roll music. And it paved the way for a lot of the kind of love songs to Jesus that would come in later decades. One of his most well-known works was he was invited to score a movie called The Restless Ones, which was a Billy Graham evangelistic movie about teenagers. The soundtrack from that movie became very popular. I bring it up because you can't see it very well on these slides. I'm sorry that the quality is so poor. But for many American teenagers, this movie was the first time that they saw someone leading worship with a guitar. You can see the guitarist there and the guitarist there. It's this small band that has 2 acoustic guitars, a banjo, and an upright bass. Upright bass like one usually brings to swimming parties at the beach, but they did in this movie. And so you have the guitar starting to make its way in and become something that's common in worship. This really takes off when we get to the 1970s with the Jesus People movement and the beginnings of what will later become the Christian contemporary music industry. So the Jesus movement had its origins in the hippie counterculture in the United States and Canada, particularly in the West Coast of the United States. And by the late 1960s, this alternative movement had its own newspaper and coffee houses and Jesus People movements in college campuses and churches and communes. And possibly the best known, at least in communities of faith at that time, was Calvary Chapel, which was a non-denominational charismatic church in Costa Mesa, California. So Calvary Chapel's pastor, Chuck Smith, there's Chuck on the bottom right-hand corner, was one of the few ministry leaders of that time who was willing to, and not just willing, excited about bringing hippies into his church and ministering to them. And he encouraged them to use their folk expressions and their rock and roll expressions to praise God. And one of the lasting things that Smith did at Calvary Chapel was to found a label called Maranatha Music in 1971. And Maranatha was founded to promote the young hippie music that folks from his church and around the area were singing up and down the California coast. And two kinds of songs were emerging from this movement. One type we could call message songs. So they were more evangelistic songs, or there's something where the singer is talking about their own experience with Christ and communicating that to an audience. It's more of a performer-listener kind of a dynamic. The second kind of song that emerged from this time was a praise chorus. And some of the ones from early 1970s are still with us today. If you've ever sung Seek Ye First or Father I Adore You or music from that time, it really fits the 1970s. You could pick it up easily on a guitar. It's a limited melodic range. You can join in after your first time hearing it. And it's the simplicity of direct words from Scripture being sung in songs. So the 1970s marks the beginning of a company that's intentionally publishing and disseminating this kind of music, and it marks the beginning of praise and worship that's going to become an even more important genre in the 1980s. So the 1980s brings a couple of important developments. One of them is the beginning of Vineyard Association of Churches, which was founded in 1982 by John Wimber. It was an offshoot of Calvary Chapel. It was more focused on charismatic gifts and healing and speaking in tongues. And John Wimber and the Vineyard movement started their own publishing company in 1984, Mercy Publishing. You can see a songbook there on the right, a whole cassette ministry. That's John Wimber there at the piano in the late 1970s. One of the gifts that the Vineyard movement gave us was a particular theology of praise and worship that was really influential in the 1980s. And I'm using the words praise and worship separately, and I do that intentionally. Because there was a theology of worship as a movement that takes us from the outer courts, drawing on Old Testament imagery, into the Holy of Holies. And so the praise songs that you would sing at the beginning of the service were the upbeat, energetic, usually used language of we, were communal. If you know a song like "We Bring the Sacrifice of Praise into the House of the Lord," that's an example from that time. And they would gradually grow quieter and quieter until we were in the Holy of Holies with God. They were focused on I, first person singular. They were more melodic, often minor in key. I think one example that might still be sung is "As the Deer" would be an example of the worship kind of song. And so there was the idea that music is literally bringing us into the presence of God, and that when God is in our presence, God will change the community. And it wasn't just the music, it was also the practices of more charismatic communities that made their way into mainstream Protestant evangelical congregations. So music takes on a new importance And it's becoming something that is in many ways as important as the preaching of the word, the sermon that had the central place in churches. Now music is a part of that too. In addition to Vineyard, which is kind of taking us from the praise stream of Maranatha, there's another development in the 1980s. If anybody recognizes here a young Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith, that is that Christian contemporary music is starting to come into its own. So Christian contemporary music, CCM, is at that time primarily focused outside the walls of the church. These songs tended to be very concise, expertly crafted, piano-based pop songs that were catchy enough for commercial appeal, but they were still simple enough for group singing. So a lot of these songs are featured on Christian radio. They wouldn't necessarily be sung in church, but they would be something that you would listen to in your extracurricular time. A couple songs from CCM during that time did make their way into the sanctuary. A couple of examples would be Michael W. Smith's How Majestic Is Your Name and Great Is the Lord. Amy Grant, from her album Straight Ahead in 1984, introduced the song Thy Word to the church. So there was a little bit of spillover at that time. So CCM is becoming a player. And then the third thing that happens is the beginnings of CCLI, Christian Copyright Licensing International. A lot of us are old enough to remember this period in the church, and maybe that fuzzy picture of an overhead projector with somebody standing there to flip the transparencies as the lyric changes. That might summon a deep memory for some of you, as it did for me. What's happening is a lot of these songs from Vineyard or some of the church songs from Christian contemporary music are being sung congregationally, but they're not included in hymnals, and churches want to teach them to their congregations. So in the 1980s, overheads are used to project the lyrics so that you can change songs quickly. They also helped a more charismatic style of worship. You could raise your hands while you were singing. You weren't tied to a hymnal. And it was possible for churches to reproduce things very quickly and cheaply before they became published in official songbooks. Technically, churches should have been requesting permissions for these songs that they were using. But to be fair to churches, it was a really arduous process at the time. It meant you had to know something about copyright law. This is before the internet, so you're making lots of long-distance phone calls and going through the phone chain, trying to get to the right person to connect you to the music director. So for many churches, it was easier to just move ahead illegally because they didn't have the time or the resources or a full-time staff person to deal with all of this. And on the other hand, copyright owners, of course, are also frustrated. They're fielding hundreds of calls from churches every month, and they're answering the same questions over and over, trying to educate churches. And they're spending a lot of administrative time and money giving out these licenses at $5 and $10 a time, and it was just complicated. So the eventual solution is the creation of CCLI. And the idea behind CCLI was to provide a blanket permission of use that individuals could buy that would cover all of the songs that they were singing in church on Sunday. So every church pays CCLI on a sliding fee, depending on the size of the congregation. And in exchange, every 2 years, the church is required to send back to CCLI a survey of what songs it used during a 6-month period. And then based on those detailed polls that they get back from churches, CCLI then distributes royalties to songwriters and publishers according to what music is being used the most. So CCLI solves a very practical and important problem. It also has some interesting ripple-down effects. One of them is the dissemination of music. Happens a lot more broadly and more quickly. From the 1960s to the 1980s, there wasn't the same kind of centralized system for finding new songs. If you were in a vineyard church, you probably heard the vineyard songs that were being passed around through Mercy Publishing. Same thing with Maranatha music. If you were part of that congregation or those streams, you were learning new songs that way. But it's important to remember that it wasn't until the 1990s that a person could show up at their local Christian bookstore and just browse a variety of cassettes and CDs from a variety of sources. So CCLI means that more eyes are on the music and it can be shared more easily. The second thing that CCLI does for us is now for the first time we have a way to look at what people are actually singing. And it allows us to produce a ranking of the songs that are most popular at the time. And that helps to reinforce worship music having a particular kind of an industry standard catalog of songs. And a particular kind of worship sound starts to evolve. So as we move into the 1990s, one of the important shifts of this era, I'll call it the beginnings of personality-driven worship. So the 1990s usher in a time where more emphasis is being placed on the worship leader. And it's a real departure from the worship model of the 1980s. I'm going to show you a couple slides of the early Maranatha albums from the 1970s, 1980s. And take a look. This is Praise 1, Praise 2. They had all numerical sequencing. The pictures that you see are all depicting nature or a castle or a sunset or something beautiful in God's creation. It says Maranatha on the label, but the performers were the Maranatha singers, and that's all that anybody knew about them. They didn't list individual names. They didn't want the distraction of focusing on individuals that were producing the movement or producing the music. The idea was to remove all distractions and keep one's focus on God. So this anonymity was intentional. Ron Canoli, a fantastic gospel singer, was one of the first personalities to emerge in worship leading. He remembered submitting a demo tape to Maranatha and being told that his voice couldn't be used because it had too much personality. That was maybe 1984. His voice stood out. And by 5 or 6 years later, the industry had shifted completely. Canoli went to work for Integrity Music, and he said that the company, quote, was excited for me to lead praise and worship that emerged out of my own personality. So the days of faceless worship are now over, and Ron Canoli is probably one of, if not the first face to be featured on the artwork of a praise and worship album in that time. Another development that happens in the 1990s that brings more exposure to worship music are large interdenominational worship conferences and events. Many of the worship celebrities that were promoted by praise and worship producers also served as pastors at their local churches, and they led their congregations at denominational conferences, and eventually they became international worship conferences. And as worship music is becoming more of a recognized genre, its commercial infrastructure grows beyond the United States. So suddenly we have songs that are available to U.S. churches from outside of the United States. And particularly influential in the 1990s were the songs of Hills Christian Life Center, which we may now know as Hillsong, which was a several thousand member Pentecostal church in Sydney, Australia. And its dynamic worship leader was Darlene Check. There's Darlene. You may recognize from the lyrics that is her and a worship choir at one of these conferences singing "Shout to the Lord," which was distributed and produced by Integrity Music. And by 1999, according to CCLI charts, it was the second most sung song in the United States. So we're getting more faces attached to the worship industry. This trend is going to continue in the early 2000s. The 2000s, we're still working out the nomenclature for what to call the music of this era. Modern worship is the phrase that's often used. It's a little clunky, especially now. What are we? Postmodern music, and it could go on and on. But we needed a label that would signify that this was a sound that was different than what was being produced in the 1980s and even 1990s. The sound of modern worship was modeled more after groups like U2 and Radiohead and later Coldplay. And it's a very different style than the more soft rock sound of praise and worship in the 1990s. So a couple of things that shift here. One of them is that a lot of the new music that develops in the early 2000s comes from outside the United States. We started to see that with Hillsong in Australia, but it's to an even greater degree in the early 2000s. So Matt Redman is from England, is one songwriter that becomes prominent during this time. A group called Delirious becomes prominent. In particular, artists and songs from the UK really skyrocketed to popularity in the United States very quickly. So much so that there's an ethnomusicologist, Monique Ingalls, who calls this time the British invasion of American worship music, modeled, of course, after the Beatles. At the same time, we're getting music from the UK. In the States, we have worship artists or worship bands that start writing and performing worship music exclusively. Chris Tomlin is one example of this. So that's Matt Redman there on the left from the UK, Chris Tomlin on the right. We saw in the 1980s and 1990s that there were some artists that would produce a song, Michael W. Smith's Great is the Lord. You could sing it in church or on the radio, but Michael W. Smith is primarily a CCM artist who happens to dabble a little in worship. In 2000s, you have worship artists that producing and performing worship music is the core of what they do. And in the early 2000s, in fact, worship music becomes the fastest growing segment of the US popular music industry. And by the year 2000, worship music is growing as a commercial genre. A lot of Christian record labels start to be incorporated into general market labels like EMI and BMG and Sony. And so for the first time, you get things like worship CDs being sold in Walmart or in Target. They have different distribution networks. So people are discovering songs that way. The other thing that's happening is that more and more frequently, people are learning new worship songs not because they sung them for the first time in church, but because they learned them through some outside venue, like a commercial recording that they heard on Christian radio, or through a music video, or, like this slide shows, through multi-city worship concerts or worship tours from top celebrity worship leaders. And one of the things that starts to happen as we see this commercial boom in worship music is that the shelf life of a worship song, if we can use that language, starts to shorten. People want more variety in the songs that they're singing in churches. And that's only going to accelerate as we get to the next era. That brings us up to, I don't know, mid-2000s to kind of right now. One of the developments that's been significant in the last 10 to 15 years has been the consolidation of worship music brands. There was research that came out from a group of scholars called worshipleaderresearch.com. They have all kinds of interesting infographics and statistics if you check out their website. But one of their findings was that almost 100% of the top 25 worship songs are associated with just a handful of megachurches. So at this moment, most of the new worship songs that achieve popularity are either written by this church's songwriting group or by an individual associated with the church. And the big four are Bethel Church in Redding, California, Hillsong, which we have talked about already in Australia, Elevation Church, which had Southern Baptist affiliation and is in North Carolina, and Passion Church, or the Passion Movement in Atlanta, Georgia area. So for this study, the researchers compared popular songs that were written before 2010 with those that were written from 2010 to 2020. And they discovered an interesting shift, which is that it's not individuals like a Chris Tomlin or a Matt Redman writing popular songs anymore, so much as it is these big collectives. And that leads us to another interesting feature of our modern era, which is that the shelf life of worship music has really shrunk. This research group found out that worship songs don't last as long as they used to. In fact, the average lifespan of a worship song is about 1/3 of what it was 30 years ago. And that makes sense. If you think about the 1990s, people are hearing songs on the radio and they're hearing them through conferences, and they would go back and teach their congregations, and you would sing the song for 3 weeks in a row and then maybe take a break and bring it back the 4th week, and it would become part of the church's regular rotation. Now, folks are learning new worship music immediately as it comes out on Apple Music and Spotify and through streaming and videos on YouTube. And a lot of congregants know a new worship song even before they set foot in the door of the church, and they're asking their worship leader, could we please program this one? So the whole process moves at a much different pace. For some congregations, that's a problem. For other congregations, they're less concerned with the longevity of a song and more concerned about, is this meeting someone's need in the moment? Is this a life raft song that can get a person through their particular time? The song doesn't need to necessarily be relevant in 2035. It just needs to be able to connect to today, which gives the worship leader a lot of freedom and I think a lot of responsibility. So let me close with just 2 thoughts on these developments, and then we can open to any questions you might have. I notice 2 tensions these days. I notice a lot more than 2 tensions, but at least these 2. One is the tension between novelty and formation. The fact that worship music has a shorter shelf life than it used to is a real double-edged sword. So church leaders have a sometimes overwhelming number of options. And on one hand, it's really hard to say no to good songs that you like and that your congregation likes. On the other hand, I think we have to grapple with the unintended consequences of turning worship music into a disposable commodity. I think back to the 1980s and the technology of listening to music on a cassette tape. I don't know if you've had that experience where it was a pain in the neck before CDs to fast forward through the song that you didn't like. And so you ended up just listening to it to get to the one that you did. And over time, the song grows on you, and eventually it becomes one that you really love. But that had to be because you tried it out for a while, even though you didn't like it at first. And I think there needs to be some room to do that. Another factor that goes into this novelty versus formation is just the way that our brains are wired. I was really fascinated to read this research, and maybe it will resonate with you too, that researchers found that whatever was popular during our teenage years musically, particularly between the years of 11 and 14, that's what we're going to love from that point on in our lives. Like that 11 to 14-year-old time of music is our heart music. And then our musical tastes start to get locked in stone when we hit about age 24. And then by age 31, I hate to say it, we're kind of in the middle of a musical paralysis that we can't get out of. We'll listen to new things, but the desire to go out and learn the entirety of Taylor Swift's canon, it's not with many of us after the age of 31. So that has interesting repercussions for worship music. Brain science says that the distribution of memories across the lifespan is the thickest at the ages between 20 and 30. We have what we call a reminiscence bump. That's the time that memories get embedded the most deeply. The songs are most closely linked to our personal memories. And so as I think about worship music in churches where we have 5, 6 generations, sometimes worshiping in church. Wow, the heart music of an 80-year-old from when they were between the ages of 11 and 14 is different than that of a 50-year-old, is different from that of a 20-year-old, is different than that of an 8-year-old. So what kinds of music are we programming that are really going to form people that way? A second tension that I'll point out, and this has more to do with the lyrical content of songs, is there's a tension between universality and particularity in songwriting. When I look at the artists that are writing much of the music in the big four, these are folks that are in their 30s, their 40s at a particular time in life. A liturgical folk artist named Ryan Flanagan once had this great quote that life is a bell curve of simplicity and complexity. The beginning and the end are the most simple. And if we aim for the people in the middle, whose lives are the most complicated and cluttered and noisy, it's difficult for the folks on either end of the spectrum to participate. And perhaps there's something true about that in worship music too. That if we are doing songwriting that comes out of our personal experience as a 30-year-old and the complications that life offers at that point, does it mean that we're leaving behind life experiences of those who are much younger or those who are much older? So what are we doing in contemporary worship to make it genuinely intergenerational? I could keep going, and I think I have gone on longer than I probably should have, but I'll stop there and would be delighted to hear any of your reflections or personal experience or questions that you might have.
So we have a few minutes for questions. If you're here in the room, you can raise your hand, and Stephanie Terrell will be around with question cards. Then she'll collect them and bring them up here to us. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or email me, pthompson@stbarts.org.
So one question that emerged for me as you were speaking was, so much of this music is mediated via cassette or CD, which lends itself to more of a private experience of consumption, whereas worship, from Christian history has been a corporate act. Yeah. Can you identify some of the theological themes that are at stake when worship is either corporate or private?
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. And I think it leads to just one of the big questions that I've had about corporate worship music at all. There's not a definition between this song is meant for private use, this song is meant for public use. In some ways, it was easier in the 1990s when it was, this is my private music that I'm listening to on Christian radio. We're not going to sing it Sunday morning, but that's okay because there's a different collection of songs I sing Sunday. I do feel like we've lost something in that distinction. Theologically, there are themes that the church as a corporate body needs to be singing about. If you look at the index, the topical index in a hymnal, there are seasons of the church year. There are songs for communion. There are songs for evangelism. There are things that we should be singing about together and need to be in a room to sing well together. And that's really different than latching onto a song in an idiosyncratic way because, yeah, this meets where I am at the moment. Which is not to say one is better and one is worse, but they do serve two different kinds of functions.
Sorry about that. So we have one question that was addressed to the St. Bart's clergy, but I will turn it into a question addressed to you. The question to St. Bart's clergy is, have we sung CCM in any of our services? Why or why not? And the short answer is mostly not on Sundays, a little more at Imagine Worship on Thursdays. And if we do it on Sundays, it would be at a 9 a.m. maybe once a year, and it would be like Seek Ye First.
Sure.
So the question I'll turn that into for you is, as someone that has been a bridge between mainline and non-mainline contexts, how can you explain the silos that we're in musically? I was watching folks as you were talking. There were a few folks that were nodding with heavy recognition as you were talking about some of these songs and artists, and I think a lot of people have no idea what any of these songs or artists are.
No, that's fair.
How can you explain that kind of silo, the ways in which we have kept ourselves in silos around music?
Yes, there are probably a lot of great answers to that question, but I think a lot of it boils down to who is the gatekeeper in your church. If you are a non-denominational church that is not connected to a larger church authority, and you don't necessarily have, here's a Lutheran hymnal, here's the 1981 hymnal, here are the resources that my governing body has put together, you're making different choices. And there's something about a hymnal that has gone through a committee that has been vetted by experts who have looked at things theologically, musically, and tried to make that well-balanced diet, versus an independent leader at a non-denom church, at a Pentecostal church, that doesn't use a hymnal and is more reliant on what am I hearing out in the world right now and what do I think is going to suit my congregation best. And it's a real struggle. There are a lot of congregations that maybe want to use some of the contemporary music, but have committees that have a sort of vetting process. Does this match up with who we are theologically? We are a strongly Reformed congregation. Does the Pentecostal theology that's coming through in this Bethel song, is that a theological mismatch? So I think that's part of the answer.
There are several questions about secular recognition of worship music. How is this music recognized in entities like the Grammy Awards? To what extent have worship and CCM artists made it big in the secular music world as well?
Yeah, there are some instances of that. I think Christian music has, I talked about the teen counterculture that YFC set up. In some ways, the whole Christian music industry has done that with its own Dove Awards as opposed to the Grammy Awards, and you can track rankings there. There are some folks that have successfully crossed over and can have one foot in both worlds, but they are definitely the minority.
A question about the influence of Vatican II on the development of evangelical music.
Yeah, Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II changed things for Protestant churches as well as Roman Catholic churches. And so even as the Jesus people are experimenting with Seek Ye First and their guitars in worship, on the Catholic side of things, we are getting folk masses and more Peter row the boat ashore and different kinds of folk melodies that are making their way into the Catholic Church. So there's some parallels there. I think Vatican II taught evangelical Protestant churches a lot, even in terms of what kind of emphasis are we putting on Scripture, how can we put things into the vernacular. A lot of Protestant churches would have been using thee and thou kinds of languages prior to Vatican II, and it really just changed the landscape for everybody.
Your questions about worship as a commercialized thing, worship as entertainment, what concerns theologically are there about these expressions of worship?
Oh, none. I think it's just, sorry, I can't even do that with a straight face. It's a double-edged sword. I think that's the best way to put it. I think that there can be a real, okay, let me start with the positive. I think there's beauty in a worship concert that's held outside of a church that can bring together Christians from different denominations, and it can cross some theological lines, and there's something about being in a crowd of people singing praise to God that just fills us up emotionally and is a really beautiful, powerful thing. That's one part of it. The flip side of that is, are we making that kind of concert experience our emotional norm, and are we expecting that sound and that feeling in our churches? And what does that mean if you are a smaller congregation, even that doesn't have the resources to do that level of multi-tracking or lights or moving background kinds of things? I think worship concerts can set our expectations unfairly high. Another interesting phenomenon about these worship conferences is that folks kind of gravitate toward the one that appeals to them. So you can go to a Elevation concert, or you can go to a Passion night of worship, and you're starting to develop a theological flavor in their music that you're bringing that expectation back to your church. Boy, I wish my church was more like Bethel. Yeah, that can be harmful.
I'll ask one more question from our audience and then turn it over to Nathan for a final thought. A question about lyrical development over time. You talked about that a little. Can you say more about the shifts that took place in the lyrics over the 50 or 60 years you've looked at today?
Yeah. It's up and down and up and down. It's a pendulum that always corrects itself. So I think that early on, the YFC songs were getting a lot of love song to Jesus kind of language, and it's parodied as Jesus is my boyfriend sorts of music. And that becomes a real thing for quite a while. As we move into the modern worship era, there are folks that are trying to balance that out with a more, okay, we need a cosmic understanding of who God is. Let's write a song like God of Wonders Beyond Our Galaxy and sing that in church. Or we need more songs that have some lament to them. So if you've heard the song, Matt Redman's song, 10,000 Reasons, some more emotional complexity. And part of this contemporary worship music movement has also been hymn writers like Keith and Kristen Getty that are still writing in a style that more closely matches traditional hymnody, but they're trying to do it in a new and a fresh way. So you've also got contemporary writers that are adapting old hymns and giving them a new bridge and trying to hold on to that. I see more of that happening. So it's been all over the place.
Can you say just a word or two about how your own faith has influenced your academic work?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a non-denominational evangelical church as a musician, and took that love with me to grad school, where everyone's faith gets challenged and stretched, mine being no exception. But part of what I wanted to do in grad school was to remain within my evangelical tradition and kind of give some academic language to explain the shifts that I saw happening. And so I've committed to staying within evangelicalism, and I think that I bring a unique perspective that there aren't a lot of folks that study liturgical theology that are interested in the big four, and I think it's something our congregations need to be aware of. So that's one way I hope I'm shaping the field. The flip side of that is I did my PhD at Notre Dame. I've studied with Roman Catholics. I went to Yale Divinity School, which is squarely mainline Protestant. And I've made dear and deep friends at all of those places. And I have students that I love from those places. And I always carry them on my shoulder whenever I am speaking about somebody else's tradition and thinking about correctives to mine. What am I saying in a way that does justice to the people that I love that aren't within the evangelical framework?
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ross, for being with us today. It's been wonderful to have you. Next week, we welcome Professor Isaac Sharp from Union Theological Seminary, who will talk with us about the history of socially progressive, feminist, and gay activists in the movement of evangelicalism in America.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. We hope you'll stick around, whether online or in person, and join us for worship at 11 a.m. I'm not sure we're singing anything that was written after 1900, so